Have you ever thought about scheduling your sprint? No? Maybe you should think about it. I'm Rogério Manso and I'm gonna help you start project now. Scheduling a sprint is not a Scrum event. We know that the framework Scrum have 5 events: the sprint planning, the sprint review, the sprint retrospective, and the daily Scrum. I would like to talk especially about the sprint planning. In the sprint planning, we initiate the sprint. We create a plan to be followed during the sprint. This plan will be created by the entire Scrum team, and they will be responsible for this plan and for the deliverables. In this sprint plan, we should address in general some questions. For example, why is this sprint valuable? What is the value of this sprint? What can be done in this sprint? And how will the chosen work get done? The developers, the Scrum team, the Scrum Master and the product owner will look at the product backlog, and they will select some product backlog items to include in the sprint in order that at the end they deliver some increment with value to the customer. But Scrum Guide does not mention about scheduling the sprint. And it's something that I've been experiencing with some teams, that when we go to schedule some events, some activities in the plan, in the sprint, there are some small points that I like to address with you in this video. The first question is, what impact the scheduling the events could have in your sprint? Let's take a look, for example, a 4-week sprint, a sprint that will take about 4 weeks. So we have week 1, 2, 3, and 4, okay? And normally in the first day of the week 1, we're gonna do the sprint planning. In a 4 weeks sprint, a sprint planning normally takes 8 hours. As you can see here, we have the first week, the 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours afternoon, and the sprint planning will take, I would say, the whole day. So far, so good. Now, after scheduling the sprint planning, we're gonna see the daily Scrum. Once you finish the Scrum planning, the sprint planning, we're gonna start working in your sprint, and you're gonna perform all daily Scrums. It takes about 15 minutes every day. So we're gonna schedule these 4 weeks until before the last day of this sprint, because in the last day we're gonna present the sprint review. The sprint review is an event that takes, in a 4 weeks sprint, about 4 hours. Could be less, but let's assume that we're gonna spend the whole 4 hours in this 4-week sprint. After you finish your sprint review, Scrum says that you need to do the sprint retrospective. And the sprint retrospective is something that takes, in general, 3 hours for a 4 weeks sprint. As you can see in this schedule, 4 weeks, we have the sprint planning in the first day, then we're gonna start working daily Scrum every day, and in the last day of the week 4, we're gonna start doing the sprint retrospective and the sprint review. At this moment, we assume that your sprint is finished. It's over. But you see, you still have 1 hour remaining for this last day. And the Scrum guide says that you should start your next sprint immediately after you finish the previous sprint. The first question is, when you gonna start your next sprint? It's on Friday in 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock Friday, or you're gonna wait until Monday? So the best idea, what I see people doing is they will start the next sprint in the next Monday. So they will finish the sprint on Friday by 4 o'clock, and they will not start the next sprint exactly after this sprint. They will wait until Monday, because this 1 hour, it's not, I would say, is not well used in terms of the production once you finish your sprint to start the next sprint, because you're gonna work. In fact, what you're gonna do is, if you follow the Scrum guide as is, this 1 hour will be the first hour of your next sprint planning. So we're gonna start 1 hour of the sprint planning, and you're gonna continue in the Monday. It's not doesn't make sense to do this. So you're gonna, let's say, waste this 1 hour in this 4th week because you finish your sprint 1 hour earlier. But it's not a big deal. If you're a 4-week sprint, you can wait until Monday to start your new sprint. But let's see what happens in a 2 weeks sprint. In a 2 weeks sprint, you have week 1 and week 2, and in Scrum Guide we say that you're gonna use less time for your sprint planning. So assuming that a 4 weeks sprint you takes 8 hours, in a 2 weeks sprint you're gonna take about 4 hours, and which means that you're gonna start in the week 1 in the morning, finish your sprint planning, and then you're gonna go working in your sprint, and the next day you're gonna have your daily Scrum in the morning. Another point is, where's the best time to schedule your Scrum, daily Scrum? But let's keep this question by the end. This is a 2 weeks sprint, and then the next week you're gonna work until Thursday, because you need to have time to do your sprint retrospective and sprint review. And your sprint review will be on Friday for 2 hours. 4-week sprint, you take 4 hours for a sprint review. 2 weeks sprint, you can take 2 hours. Could be less, but assuming that you are spending the time proportional to a 2 weeks sprint. So your sprint review will take 2 hours in the morning, and your sprint retrospective will take about 1 hour and a half, because 4 weeks it takes 3 hours, 2 weeks sprint it takes about 1 hour and a half. And you see again, you have half hour before noon that you have nothing to do, because afternoon you're gonna start your next sprint with your sprint planning, and then you're gonna plan again the week 3 and 4. And your sprint planning, the second sprint, it's on Friday afternoon, and you're gonna again set the Scrum, daily Scrum until Wednesday, because it's a 2 weeks sprint, and you started on Friday, so we're gonna finish the next sprint on Thursday. And on Thursday, again, you do the sprint review, you do the sprint retrospective, and again, you wait half hour until noon to start the afternoon, your following sprint. As you can see, in a 2 weeks sprint, for every sprint, you're gonna go back 1 day in a week. This is not a big problem because you can, organize this, but it's important that you organize, schedule your meetings to keep the sprint duration fixed during your project. If, for example, in a 2 weeks sprint, when you finish your sprint retrospective and you start the sprint planning only in the next week, you're gonna lose half day in the week 2, and you not follow the Scrum guide that says that you need to start your sprint just after you finish the previous one. So this is just to show you how it's important to organize your schedule in your sprints. I'm assuming in this example that your working day is 7.5 hours per day, and which means your week 37.5 hours, which is a total of 150 hours in 4 weeks. And your sprint planning takes 8 hours. Daily meeting will spend in the whole 4 weeks sprint 4.5 hours just in this daily meeting. Also, you're gonna spend 4 hours for sprint review and 3 hours for your sprint retrospective. If you don't schedule that hour that you finish in the last day, you're gonna have in total, with no refinement effort, about 130 hours and a half of working hours in your sprint, 4 weeks. Assuming that you're gonna spend 10% of this time for refine your product backlog, you're gonna have only 117 hours and a half to work in your sprint backlog. But as we waste 1 hour, in fact, you're gonna have 116 and a half hours per developer in a 4 weeks sprint. This is an important information, because if, for example, you have 7 developers in your team, you should estimate the effort, or like say the hours, the number of hours you're gonna work in your sprint to 815. And when you go to your product backlog, identify the items, you need to more or less get inside this duration, 815 hours of effort of work. Of course, there's a lot of situations and constraints and points that you need to evaluate when you identify the product backlog items that you're gonna input in your sprint backlog. Some assumptions that you need to manage is how many ideal day it's in your group. It's 7.5, it's 8, it's 6 hours. So we know that a Scrum team, the ideal day is not the amount of hours that you have in your working day. This is important that you, as a Scrum Master, as a product owner, or even as a developer, you need to think about it. What is really the ideal, the number of hours in your ideal day? If you stay in your office for 8 hours, how many hours you really stay focused on coding or working. Another point, you need to think about the holidays during the sprint. It will be moments in your sprint that some holidays will have in your sprint, so you need to rethink the date. If you, for example, if you schedule a sprint review or sprint retrospective in a Friday that you have a holiday, you need to move this event to the next week, and then you're gonna change the dates that you're gonna finish the next sprint. Wasting time, and this is a very difficult information to have in your group, because as I said, the ideal is to work with ideal hours, ideal day, but we know that it's impossible. Sometimes we think that our ideal day is 6 hours per day, but we never know what happens in this meantime. So most of the time you're gonna waste time during your sprint that you will not be able to work in production. Another point you need to think is, do you need in your group to have a pre-meetings preparation? For example, for the sprint review, do you need to meet your team before the sprint review to organize the meeting, to identify how you're going to present your increment, your sprint result? If you need to have meetings to prepare, for example, for the sprint review, you need to include this in your agenda, in your schedule. And also you need to think about the next sprint work, when you're going to start, if you are ready, if something happens in the sprint review or sprint retrospective. Could be that for some reason they need to make some adjustments in your product backlog and you'll not be able to start your next sprint. So all these points, when we talk about scheduling a sprint, it's just to make sure that your team, Scrum team, will be really focused on production, an increment, and more than that, that your data about their productivity, velocity, production, number of story points, and everything that you're gonna use to measure the team's productivity, it's balanced with your agenda. So when you use 2 weeks sprint or 4 weeks sprint, this could have a variance that sometimes as short as your sprint is, it's more important that you take in consideration these points, because in a short sprint, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the impact of 1 hour wasted or 2 hours in a new meeting have a bigger impact, a bigger result in your productivity. So think about this, and maybe I'm not saying that you need to, in your next sprint, to have a tool or, I don't know, an agenda, Outlook, and schedule your events, because we are assuming that your group, your team is co-located, they are close to each other, and it's easy to organize. Usually you don't schedule a daily Scrum. The daily Scrum, everyone is close to in the workroom, and you can just say, okay, let's go guys, let's go to our daily Scrum. But the sprint review, usually you need to invite the stakeholders, the sponsor, I don't know who else, and these people needs to be aware that they need to have a space in their agenda to participate in this meeting. So you need to set this meeting in the calendar. The sprint planning also, you could need someone external to help you in in planning the sprint. So that's why it's important to think about scheduling a sprint, because it's not only the Scrum team that is involved in this process. You have maybe a lot of people external to the Scrum team that need to attend this meeting. And that's not why you need to pay attention on this. Think about productivity of your Scrum team, but also think about the availability of the other stakeholders in your project, and then you're gonna have a better productivity and better results.